These are images of real wise women and healers around the world. But wise women also look like this. On my journey to become a rabbi and a therapist, I was first a student of human nature. As a child, I was multilingual. As an autodidact, I taught myself the Hebrew language, given the limitations within my community. My career spanned both military and civil service, as well as administration. But my true love was always natural health and counseling. In my 20s, I felt that I was an old soul in a young body. I embraced my childhood intuition, and I pursued the studies of ancient and traditional medicine. In my 30s, I was blessed to be mentored by the most senior Kabbalist in the Western world, the late Rabbi Yitzhak Kaduri in Jerusalem. But given these uncommon triumphs, it is important for us to remember that wise women long before me encountered greater barriers. Historians agree that written history began 3,500 before the Common Era. But there are those, including authors, that believe that female leadership began much earlier, at 26,000 before the Common Era. They hold that the mysterious power of women in procreation and childbirth held the balance between men and women in the tribal circles. At the dawn of time, we learn of queens and rulers in Egypt, Athens, Rome, all the way also to China. These priestess healers are also termed that the very first time we see them in the ancient writings. They are the ones that perform the ceremonies in the temples. They manage the houses of healing and the spas. They feed the hungry, heal the sick, and they bury the dead. But the keystone of their work is compassion, empathy, and a need for social justice. Professor Sabina Tubal, in her book, Sarah the Priestess, posits that Abraham's wife Sarai was not only performing the community services, but she was also a gifted healer and taking care of those in need. And the archaeological areas near the Ur of Chaldees show indication that the houses of worship also seem to be community centers for the underserved. We know and learn that Serach, the granddaughter of Isaac, was a healer. She could soothe those in mental torment, and those familiar with the Old Testament have read of Myriam and Yocheved as Egyptian Jewish midwives. But what is not commonly known is that when you study the Ebers, Hurst, and the Kahuna papyri, when studying about Sais and Heliopolis centers in Egypt, the medical academies were run entirely by women, highly educated women, that were well-versed in astronomy, astrology, mathematics, the general sciences, chemistry, and herbalism. And just in case you might ask, what does chemistry have to do with the ancient world? I'd like to point out that Cleopatra was a master chemist. Yes, she did use it for cosmetics, but she loved political intrigue and a little bit of poison. Hammurabi's codes, a set of laws, actually had tax provisions for female healers. So this implies that this was a genuine career. But by 1100, before the Common Era, after the queen's passing, women were now barred from performing any ceremonies, religious or healing. But still, I believe that 2,000 years of professional freedom is nothing to scoff at. The ancient world continues to oppress women in education, and this is a time of heavy influence by Pythagoras, Empedocles, Hippocrates, Aristotle, and Socrates, due to the high mortality rate of childbirth with the women. The women complained that the male physicians were not familiar enough with a woman's body, and that they also lacked the empathy to understand their discomforts and diseases. Along comes Agnotica of Athens, a female physician impersonating a man, but she is betrayed by a male physician out of jealousy, and she is tried for the crime of practicing medicine. But the women of Athens won't have it, and much to the consternation of the leaders and senators of the time, the women asked, "Free her, because she does us a service that you cannot." Yes, she is freed, and she continues to practice medicine for the rest of her life, but it also opens the door for Greek women to begin studying medicine, specifically female health. From 100 of the Common Era on, the medical and religious circles were heavily influenced by traditional medicine, which is based on the four humors. And during this time, we learn of prophetess Huldah in the 6th century, where she guides the Judean king Josiah to lead a more pious life for his people and for his kingdom, after he found a holy scroll in the temple. And 100 years later, we learn of Hisdaduk, the daughter of Rabbi Hizda, a Talmudic sage in the 2nd century, who was a wise woman and healer in her own right in Babylonia. And she was following in the footsteps of her female ancestors. But condemnation of wisdom and education for women took a new turn. Now we know of witch hunts, and we have to remember that now Europe is ravaged by a number of plagues, and the local leaders aligned themselves with the tradesmen and the guilds to bar women from obtaining permits and licenses to become healers or physicians. So we note that only the women that were related either by blood or by marriage to a physician or a chemist were the only ones exposed to the science and fortunate enough to study it. But without exception, all of them were driven by a need to care for the underserved. Their qualities: they were pragmatic, adaptable, resourceful. They could forge new paths when blocked, especially from training with their male peers. But in the end, they established their own schools of education, their own women's hospitals, and dispensaries to distribute medicine in places where there was no possibility of doing so. And this is well documented, both in the United States and in the United Kingdom. At the same time, female religious leaders are defeating the bigotry within their own institutions. And from the Middle Ages to the 19th century, their common thread is that now they are blessed by their mentors, teachers, and their peers. A goal that all of them had was to counsel those in spiritual crisis. And I believe that this happens due to the age of reason or enlightenment, which affected society. It moved away from religious fervor to religious tolerance and focused more on the academic and the secular. But a pattern arises, and it is one that remains that way for another century. Women are now compelled to choose between science or religion for a career or even for leadership opportunities. My origins reflect a long chain of commitment to the communities in which my ancestors settled. My ancestors, great-grandparents, grandparents, and parents, all led by strong pioneering women, came from the Levant, from Spain, from Europe, into the New World and the Caribbean. They didn't forget those less fortunate, and their work reflects a dedication to those suffering either mentally or physically. In 2012, when I was accepted at a rabbinical seminary, I had prepared myself for more societal challenges within my community. But 3 years later, in the ordination ceremony on July of 2015, one of the 3 rabbis that is required to perform the ordination, which is called smicha, turned to me and said, "You are a rabbi." And I felt at that moment that I had come full circle with my Jewish and Spanish ancestry. But more than that, I had crossed historical barriers to embody the modern version of the ancient female healer. Thank you.